Welcome to Dharma Talk. My name is Matthew Sokolov, the founding teacher here at One Mind Dharma. And this is our podcast where I give my Dharma talks and talk about different topics related to Dharma, Buddhism, meditation, mindfulness, compassion. As of right now, it's just me. Some weeks we'll have Elizabeth on and perhaps some other guests if I can find some. And the idea is to offer some talks. They're often kind of centered around the talks that I'm giving at the online groups or working with students one-on-one. And to offer these teachings freely as I am working on them myself. You can subscribe to the podcast at oneminddharma.com/talk. There's a link for iTunes. We'll get a link for Google Play up soon. And you can find it on Stitcher or iHeartRadio or any other podcast app. You can also subscribe via email at that link, or of course find the YouTube channel, which if you're watching this video, you probably already found the YouTube channel. We're going to talk about forgiveness this week, in case you didn't get that by the title. I just published a meditation to our podcast on forgiveness. So you can find the podcast at oneminddharma.com/meditate. And there's a link to the YouTube channel. You can subscribe via email. You can also find that podcast in any podcast app or store. But there is a forgiveness meditation on there that was published. It should be published just a day or two before this is published. And the last thing I just want to throw out there as kind of a plug is we have a new course, an introduction to Buddhism. It has like 40 some odd lessons, as Udemy calls them. And we go through everything from kind of the history of Buddhism to the early spread of Buddhism and what happened after the Buddha's death, as well as its evolution as it met different cultures and traveled around the world. And then we go into the basic core teachings, the Four Noble Truths and the Four Foundations of Mindfulness and Buddhist ethics. And then we kind of wrap up by bringing it to life, how we can take these ancient teachings and incorporate them. There's a lot of interesting things in there that I've found interesting over my own studies. Things like the fact that the Buddha was not a prince. We hear that over and over again, but it's just simply not true. There were no princes in the Buddha's community at that time. Things like the Buddhist councils or the spread of Buddhism and traditions where Buddhists actually proselytized or were sent on missions to convert others, which we don't see too much of today in our tradition. So the course is full of tons of interesting things and can really help you get a grasp on this path. That's at oneminddharma.com/learn. The course is all recorded, it's all edited. We're just kind of going through the final stages, and it should be up within a couple weeks. The goal is to have it up for sure by the end of April, and we're looking good on that goal. So as always, before I jump into just talking, I want to offer that if you ever have a question you want me or Elizabeth, either of us, to answer, either on the podcast or privately, you're absolutely welcome to email us anytime. We answer every email. info@oneminddharma.com comes to both of us, or Matthew@oneminddharma.com for me, or Elizabeth@oneminddharma.com for her. It also goes if you have a topic you want us to cover. Many of my topics come from my work one-on-one with students or our online group, which you can find at class.oneminddharma.com. It's wonderful. It's a donation-based group. We have people from all over the United States and sometimes the world join us, and it's just incredible. The power of technology. But anyway, so if you have a topic you want me to talk about or to cover or even just to mention or my thoughts on, please let me know. So forgiveness. I thought about doing like self-forgiveness or just forgiveness for others. Forgiveness is just such a huge topic to cover. Last week we talked about karma, or last episode. And karma is a teaching that has a lot of roots in kind of the suttas and in the Dharma. Forgiveness doesn't as much. It's not as much of a core teaching. It's definitely in there, in the suttas and in the discourses, but it's something that largely developed I think as Buddhism spread especially to the West. So I just want to start with a little bit about my experience, one of my experiences with forgiveness or lack thereof. Obviously, we all deal with resentments and forgiveness throughout our lives. So this isn't, it's not to say it's the only time I've had to forgive. Happens to me on a daily basis. But for a while, and this was maybe 7 years ago, when I sat in meditation, I was filled with this kind of, I don't know if guilt and shame, but resentment towards myself for some of the ways I'd behaved in the past, and specifically in intimate relationships with women. The psychological abuse and the controlling and the harsh words and unkind words and purposely harmful words, and just the horrific ways that I behaved and treated other people in my life. I think I'll leave it at that. What happened was I was sitting in meditation, I'd be doing a concentration practice, and I'd just be filled with this kind of shame, not even like a healthy shame about it, just a kind of like cold and emotionless shame, not actually feeling the pain I'd caused or anything. And I talked to my teacher about it at the time, and there was many conversations, of course, not just one. But one of the things I came to realize is that although I had taken some action in my life, I hadn't ever really worked with my own experience around it. And what I mean is that I took a lot of action as far as I went through the 12-step program when I got sober. And, one of the kind of steps is to make amends, to change behavior. And we talked about this with karma last week a little bit, that one of the ways we can cleanse our karma is by recognizing that we've caused harm, taking accountability, and then moving away from that behavior. And I did this. I stopped behaving that way in my life. And I went above and beyond and really took the time to educate myself about the ways that my behavior was causing harm to those around me. I also had a sponsor who recommended that one of the ways I can make amends was by volunteering at like a family shelter in Santa Monica. It was largely women and their children who had been abused or victims of domestic violence or violent partners. And I did that once every other week, so twice a month for a year before I moved out of Santa Monica. But just to really try to, for several reasons, to make amends for the behavior and to, kind of give back what I had taken from people, recognizing that it doesn't fix the harm I've caused, and also to educate myself and to really come into contact with the ways in which my behavior had really can cause a deep harm to someone. Great, like that, that doesn't fix it. That seems like I stand by it. It seems like a good thing to do. But I never really looked, although I spent a lot of time looking at my relationships and my behavior, I never really looked at this piece inside of myself, which was this guilt or this resentment I had towards myself. So as I was sitting in meditation, I just had this overwhelming sense of guilt, this overwhelming, as soon as I got quiet, this overwhelming sense of a lack of worth or value. Now, I'm not defending my behavior. I'm not saying that, oh, pity me because I behaved poorly and caused harm and now I'm dealing with the consequences. But I do think it points really clearly to this need for us to not just take the action or change the behavior or step away from a situation that causes harm, but to actually work internally with what's going on. I'll come back to that story in a little bit, but I want to leave that there for now, this importance of actually working with what's going on for us. So, the truth is that resentment causes suffering in our lives. The word resent itself is Latin and comes from the word re, which means again, and sentir, to feel. So it means to feel again. We can think of the common Spanish-speaking phrase, lo siento, means I feel it. Sentir means to feel in Spanish. It's the same in Latin. Resent means to feel again. And whether we're working with ourselves or we're working with somebody else, what often happens is we're kind of re-feeling this pain over and over again, and not in a healthy, conducive way. Not in the way that we're working with it and looking at it with some clarity or some insight, but it just kind of can take us over. It's just resting there waiting to kind of pounce on us. Thich Nhat Hanh, the Zen teacher who's now on his way out of this world, talks about in his book, I'm going to paraphrase, in his book, The Heart of the Buddha's Teachings, talks about how we only have kind of a finite amount of space in our heart. Not energy, but just kind of space to hold things. And when we're full of resentment and anger, it can kind of dictate how our heart sees the world and sees ourselves. With forgiveness, we can kind of let go or free up space in our hearts for more love, to kind of have the natural disposition be one of kindness and patience and compassion. It's not hard to see how our resentments cause suffering, and I want to separate out, there are types of suffering or harms caused that are minor, and there are types that are very traumatic and huge. And there's a whole spectrum in between. So I don't love the kind of dichotomy of trauma with a small t and trauma with a capital T or anything. It's a whole spectrum of harms caused. There's harms caused on a personal level when we cause harm just to another individual. There's traumas that people cause or create for other people. And then of course there's collective harms caused. I'll speak to the United States, the country I'm from. There's of course the collective harm caused of racism, of sexism. There's the harm caused of individuals across the world who are political leaders who cause harm just kind of blanket to a whole group of people. So there's a whole spectrum of harms caused. But in general, we can see how holding on to these within ourselves doesn't actually fix the problem. There's that thing of resentments like holding a hot coal, waiting to throw it at the other person, that we're just burning ourselves, or drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. That it's just kind of hurting ourselves. And I'll talk in a minute about some of the reasons we hold on to resentments and how they can serve us, of course. Jack Kornfield says, "We may still be suffering terribly from the past, while those who betrayed us are enjoying themselves on vacation. It's painful to hate. Without forgiveness, we continue to perpetuate the illusion that hate can heal our pain and the pain of others. In forgiveness, we let go and find relief in our hearts." I especially like the line, "Without forgiveness, we continue to perpetuate the illusion that hate can heal our pain and the pain of others." It just doesn't work that way. There's a great saying, and I couldn't find the source of it. I heard it from Buddy Wakefield, a poet I like, and I know I didn't want to attribute it to anyone because he took it from someone else who took it from someone else, and the origin's unclear. But forgiveness means giving up all hope for a better past. It's already past. Whatever happened already happened. And this holding on to it doesn't actually change what happened. It doesn't even necessarily change our experience of it in this moment in a healthy way. One of the reasons I find in my own life that we hold on to these resentments and don't want to forgive is it keeps us safe in a sense. I was working with Elizabeth at a treatment center in Sausalito, California, and we were doing some didactic practices, and I was working with a young man in treatment there. And the prompt was surrounding forgiveness, and the last question was, what would it look like or feel like to forgive yourself completely? And you just ask the question and the person answers, and you ask it again and the person answers, like aiming to get kind of deeper with it. And at one point he said, it feels unsafe, like I would be allowing myself to cause harm again, or allowing someone else to cause harm to me. And that's it right there for many of us. And it's not always a conscious thing. But what happens is, with ourselves, we think we cause some harm, and we think, if I forgive myself, that's being too lax. The resentment kind of works as a keeping us in the box and keeping us from causing harm. And with others, it's easy to see as well, especially with I don't want to quantify anyone's suffering, but especially with kind of the more severe forms of suffering that we experience, the types of abuse, physical, psychological, sexual, maybe the more institutionalized subjugation that happens, the racism, the sexism, the anti-Semitism, whatever it is, these bigger kind of more deeply harmful things, we can find ourselves feeling that if we forgive, that leaves us open and vulnerable. So that holding on to that resentment a little bit can help us feel a little bit more protected, I think. So it serves us, and I think that's important to see, because it's not all bad. It's not, you don't hold on to resentments because you're a bad person or you're doing something wrong. That's not true for anyone. The reason we hold on to them is because they serve us in some sense. And I don't think that means, okay, great, like let's hold on to them and screw forgiveness. But I do think it's important to not take it so personally that this is our habit. I'm teaching inside today because there's a lot of birds going on, making noise outside, and a lot of wild animals. And I just saw Tarike, a little agouti, a family just walked by with a little baby, and I got distracted. So I think that resentment coming back has that illusion of keeping us safe. And I don't know if illusion is the right word, because sometimes it does. I know that for me, I've held on to resentments, and then I'm presented with the situation again, and I say, I'm not putting myself back in that situation because my body and mind are telling me no, it's unsafe, because there's still so much pain and resentment here. So it's not just an illusion. However, the illusory piece, it's a word, the illusory piece is that we can also make that same decision out of wisdom instead of just out of fear and kind of pulling back. In the Anguttara Nikaya, a collection of the Buddha's teachings, the Buddha says that these two are fools. Which two? The one who doesn't see his or her transgression as a transgression, and the one who doesn't rightfully pardon another who has confessed his or her transgression. These two are fools. These two are wise. Which two? The one who sees his or her transgression as a transgression, and the one who rightfully pardons another who has confessed his or her transgression. These two are wise. So, first of all, the language there is his or her. I realize that's exclusive, and I wish I had read that or thought about that ahead of time. But it's really clear here that the Buddha is saying that we need to see our transgressions where we've caused harm as a transgression, and when somebody comes to us confessing their transgression, to pardon them. And this doesn't mean saying, oh, it's all good, we're friends again, great. But I think it means internally, and at least that's how I take it, and that's open for interpretation. Before I talk about kind of working with forgiveness, I just want to cover one of the sticking points for me with forgiveness, and I see it with my students, and this is actually what brought up this topic with one of my students I see one-on-one. When we forgive someone, what does that actually look like? And the truth is, it doesn't have to look like anything. Our relationship with that person or experience doesn't need to change on the surface. Forgiveness doesn't mean we allow someone back into our lives. Forgiveness doesn't mean we're buddy-buddy with someone. I think one of my personal examples was when Elizabeth and I first met. We had a mutual friend that caused us a great deal of harm, a great deal of kind of psychological or mental anguish, and was intentionally kind of seeking to cause us harm. It was somebody who didn't want us to be together, and was rather unskillful in doing so. And it caused us a lot of harm. And we both kind of fostered some resentment and let it kind of be for a while. And eventually we both ended up kind of separately, but also together, but separately in our practices, working on forgiveness for this person. And I don't know where the line is where you go from like, I don't forgive them at all, to like, oh, I've forgiven them. And I'll talk about that in a moment. But I had gotten kind of over to that part, or that piece of the process where I felt largely resentment-free towards this person. There was, of course, clarity in the fact that they were suffering in this moment. There was clarity in the fact that we had caused some pain to this person unintentionally. But as we all know, the impact isn't the same as intention always. And then, of course, there was the knowing that this is just kind of eating me alive. Years went by, and one of our friends was engaged to marry this person, and kind of came back into our lives. And we were asked to hang out together and go on double dates, kind of thing. And we made the decision to turn it down, and not out of just this fear or this resentment, or this even we can be kind of vindictive or vengeful of, you hurt me, so I'm never gonna, be friends, grace you with my presence again, kind of thing. But out of this wisdom of, I do trust people can change. I've changed greatly. I've seen Elizabeth change greatly. I've seen a lot of people through the Dharma and through recovery from addiction really grow and amend their behavior. But I didn't want to put myself back in that position or that danger of being hurt in that way again. I didn't need to invite that into my life. And it was made out of wisdom, not out of this kind of habitual tit for tat, like they hurt me, so I'm done with them kind of thing, but out of wisdom. So when I was living in that resentment, I had no relationship with this person. And when I started moving towards forgiveness, my relationship didn't really change. And I think that points to answer this question, what does forgiveness look like? It doesn't have to look like anything. Maybe you do invite that person back into your life. I've had that as well. I've had people that have caused great harm, and I've caused great harm too. And it's been very mutual. And we didn't talk for years, and they come back around, and suddenly we reconnect for whatever reason. So it doesn't have to look like anything. As far as working with forgiveness, the point I really wanted to make, and I'm already 25 minutes into this talk, but the point I really wanted to make is that forgiveness requires us to come into contact with the suffering. If you don't hear anything else I'm saying because you're driving while listening or working, which is projecting because that's what I do. I listen to podcasts while I'm doing things. Remember that forgiveness requires us to come into contact with some suffering. If there is no suffering present, there's probably no call for forgiveness. We don't need to forgive someone that there's no suffering around. I do think that along with this suffering, forgiveness is a slow process. The idea often is that we, like I said, we move from like not forgiving into forgiveness, and someone's all forgiven. And the truth is, it just doesn't happen that way most of the time. Often what happens is it's a spectrum where we kind of move forward with it. Sharon Salzberg says, "We are told that until we forgive, we will never heal. We forget that forgiveness is a grieving process that often includes the expression and release of negative emotions, especially disappointment and anger. It's no use trying to avoid these painful feelings. Forgiveness that is insincere, forced, or premature can be more psychologically damaging than authentic bitterness and rage. Forgiveness that is insincere, forced, or premature can be more psychologically damaging than authentic bitterness and rage. And this speaks to the kind of spiritual bypass piece, which I think we have an old chalkboard video that Elizabeth made. It's awesome. On our YouTube somewhere, if you type in spiritual bypass. But this kind of habit, we can go of I forgive them. I should just forgive them. That's the right thing to do. And boop, done. And it's not that easy all the time. Sometimes it is, and I don't want to, if that's your experience with something, that can be okay. But with the harmful things, we don't benefit as much as we think we do from the forced kind of forgiveness. It's a slow process of seeing the pain clearly, of feeling the pain fully. When I think about the ways that others have caused me harm, we can feel the pain and begin to work with that. Begin to have compassion for that so we can look at it with wisdom. For this resentment is often reactive rather than responsive. So once we can begin to respond with compassion, it can help us really not react with that resentment. So the way we do this is, of course, through forgiveness practice. I do think that self-compassion practice is a great place to start. I know there's some teachers that disagree with that and actually recommend starting with forgiveness. So it's up to you what you decide to do. My personal experience is to start with some self-compassion. When there's some pain, just care for it. Don't judge it. Don't try to talk yourself out of it. Just truly tune in and care for it. Then we can move into forgiveness and forgiveness meditation. As I mentioned, there should be the most recent episode of the Guided Meditation podcast is a forgiveness meditation. But this practice over time can really help us change our relationship with these resentments we have toward ourselves and toward others. I also think that we can incorporate some equanimity. Forgiveness requires some level of resilience, some ability to be with this pain and not get so knocked off balance. And that was my experience with the pain I had caused others. What was really happening was the thought or kind of memory or emotional experience of how I'd caused harm was unpleasant, and it was not so unpleasant, but my reaction, the reaction of my mind and body, was to kind of just wallow in self-pity, not compassion, not care, not seeing clearly, not true remorse or regret or wishing to make it better, just a discomfort with how I felt, a kind of selfish discomfort that I felt uncomfortable because I had caused harm to someone and just wallowed in it, totally unskillfully. And it's a habit, I don't blame myself. But the big change came for me in self-compassion and really building the ability to just be with this and see it, and then to slowly work on forgiving myself. If, we're talking about that line of where we cross into resentment, into forgiveness, or where the finish line is, I don't think I've reached the finish line with that. And the truth is, I don't know if I ever will. There are other things where people have caused me harm or I have caused harm to others, where I don't know if we ever reach a point where we've fully forgiven. But that's fine to let go of that idea that we need to and just slowly keep working for it and trusting the process. Khaled Hosseini, the author of The Kite Runner, and this is actually a quote from The Kite Runner, which is a great novel, was very popular, but this is a beautiful quote from it. I wondered if that was how forgiveness budded, not with the fanfare of epiphany, but with pain gathering its things, packing up, and slipping away unannounced in the middle of the night. I wonder if that was how forgiveness budded, not with the fanfare of epiphany, but with pain gathering its things, packing up and slipping away, unannounced in the middle of the night. I know that's from like a popular novel, but it's poignant, it's poetic, and he's right, I think, that often forgiveness doesn't come in the way that we picture it coming, this white light, oh, I see it clearly now and I forgive them. But instead, it just kind of slowly dissipates away the pain or resentment. The way we do that is by taking action. Sometimes things dissipate on their own. Someone causes some minor harm. A great example is sometimes our dog Carol just does something that I find very annoying. Elizabeth made fresh bread the other day. She heard her name. Elizabeth made fresh bread the other day, and I cut myself a slice. It was delicious. And Carol just immediately jumped up on the counter and took it. And she knows she's not supposed to do that. So not only did she take it, she took it and ran away with it. So I couldn't catch her. And of course I was upset in the moment. It didn't require dedicated forgiveness practice. But it just slowly kind of packed up its things and left in the middle of the night. But the same's true for the bigger things, whether they're forgiving ourselves for things that we've done or forgiving other people. It's not always this kind of white light experience. I think that's especially true for the more traumatic things we've experienced, the childhood abuse or the sexual abuse or maybe witnessing horrible things, the injustices that we experience either in our lives with specific events or overall because of who we are or the color of our skin or our gender identity or our sex or whatever it is. These kind of stronger pains that we experience, we don't have a white light experience around them always. It's often continual work, and it seeps away so slowly that we barely notice the growth. And I think that that's an important piece here, to really just trust it. And we don't need to check in every 5 minutes on how forgiving we're doing, but just to trust it and keep working and let it kind of fall away rather than pushing it away. One of the great realizations for me coming back around is that forgiveness is uncomfortable, and forgiveness hurts sometimes. It's been talked about by many Buddhist teachers. There's pain, there's suffering that causes more suffering, and suffering that causes liberation or freedom from suffering. This is a suffering or pain that causes liberation. That when we forgive and we get in contact with this pain, it requires us to feel uncomfortable, to feel some discomfort and be with it. But to know that as we gain wisdom and insight around it, we can leave it be and not hold on to it so closely. It doesn't need to be such a strong part of our identity. It doesn't need to be have such a big voice in dictating how we live our lives. It can still be there to guide us. This, oh, I don't want to step into this situation again or that situation. But we don't need to let it have such a strong voice. I do want to shamelessly throw out there that I wrote a book. I'm very bad at plugging it. It's done pretty well. It's sold more copies than I thought it would. I'll put it that way. It's not a bestseller, but it's sold more copies than I thought it would. People really love it. And I'm going to tie this back in. It's not just a random plug. I heard a great story the other day that Elizabeth's aunt, who works at a major law firm, had the book behind her on the bookshelf, and someone came in and said, "Oh my God, you read that book too? I love it." And she said, "Oh, my nephew-in-law wrote it." So she called me to tell me the story and was all excited. But we've gotten a lot of great feedback. I love it. It's full of a bunch of really short exercises. I wrote it. The team did a wonderful job at Callisto, my publisher, in making it beautiful. But there's some thoughts on forgiveness in here and heart practices. Specifically, if you have the book, which I know many of the Dharma Talk listeners do. 62, forgiving faults. And there's a little bit about forgiveness here, and then it just jumps right in to an exercise. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 steps, very short. They're all short chapters. And then a little bit about this safety. So if you haven't gotten the book, I recommend it. I actually had to go through and read the whole thing after I wrote it to kind of help edit it and see how it looked, and I really like it. I think you can get it at oneminddharma.com/book. But there's a few things on forgiveness and kindness and compassion when we're suffering in there that I recommend. The last thing I want to do is answer a question that I actually received from a student when I said I was going to give a talk on forgiveness. And she said, "Oh, you should talk about this. This has helped me so much." So it wasn't really a question as much as a direction, which I always appreciate, because sometimes I spew a lot of things and I like to know what's helpful or what lands, with the hopes that it'll land with others. And the question was something she had asked me before, which is, how do we work with people who continue to cause harm? Right? There are some people in our lives that are causing some sort of harm, maybe big or small, who we can't really remove from our lives for one reason or another. Maybe it's a family member, maybe it's an employee or employer or coworker or roommate, or maybe it's a political leader. At least in the United States, if you turn on any news channel, you're bound to hear somebody saying something that is harmful. And I think that my own politics are pretty clear, that I've made them clear on the website and in podcasts before. But this happens on every kind of side of the spectrum. We hear harmful and hateful speech that's not tolerant. I think in my opinion, it of course, there's a difference in what happens, or a difference in kind of the severity and the harm caused by the sides. But overall, just turning on the news, we can definitely see harm that we just can't escape. So what do we do with this? The answer is simple: keep forgiving. And I don't mean that to be dismissive. I know that I live here in Mexico, and people have many different opinions here, just like anywhere, on the current political situation in the United States. But many of them find it very harmful, and it's just nonstop. So just to keep on forgiving over and over again, and to remember that it's not necessarily, we don't necessarily reach an end, that it's not, even if the harm's already gone, we don't reach a finish line necessarily. And the same can be said for the harm caused over and over again. We were talking to someone the other day here and said, I just don't understand why President Trump continues to just say these things over and over again that are so harmful, and they hurt. And I don't have an answer. I can give my kind of guesses on why someone may speak like that or act like that or make assumptions like that. But the point is that he's going to keep doing it. It doesn't mean that we can just be angry and allow ourselves to suffer. Instead, maybe we can work with some forgiveness and act out of wisdom, act out of a more responsive, I don't know if anger is the right word, but a more responsive kind of drive or striving to make things better than just a fear and an anger. So to continue to forgive, when we have people in our lives, a family member or whoever, just to continue to forgive. It's a continual practice. So with that, that's all I have. As always, if you want to ask me any questions, you can email me at matthew@oneminddharma.com. I do my best to answer every single email I receive. I do answer every single email I receive, usually within a day or two at the most. You can visit oneminddharma.com/talk to subscribe to the podcast. You can visit and support the podcast as well. And please visit class.oneminddharma.com to join us for our weekly online live group.